In the heart of a bustling city, where history whispered through ancient cobblestone streets and towering monuments stood as silent witnesses to time, tourists from all corners of the globe flocked to experience its magic. The city was alive with energy, street vendors calling out their wares, horse-drawn carriages clattering past, and the distant hum of chatter blending into an orchestra of life. Among these visitors was Greg, a middle-aged man with a camera slung around his neck and a wide-eyed curiosity that made him stand out even in such a diverse crowd. Greg had dreamed of visiting this city for years. He'd saved every penny, read countless travel blogs, and watched endless videos showcasing its beauty. Now, standing before the majestic palace gates, he felt like a kid on Christmas morning. His excitement was infectious. Strangers nearby couldn't help but smile as he enthusiastically snapped photos of everything in sight. But Greg wasn't just here for selfies or souvenirs. He wanted to truly immerse himself in the culture. And what better way to do that than by attending the famous changing of the guard ceremony? The palace courtyard was packed with people, all craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the Guardsman. These soldiers were more than just protectors of the monarchy. They were living symbols of tradition, discipline, and pride. Clad in striking uniforms adorned with gold trimmings and tall bearskin hats, they moved with precision and purpose. Their rifles, polished until they gleamed under the sun, added a touch of solemnity to the scene. As the ceremony began, Greg found himself completely mesmerized. The rhythmic stomping of boots, the sharp commands echoing through the air, and the synchronized movements left him in awe. But Greg's enthusiasm often got the better of him. While others admired the guardsmen from a respectful distance, Greg couldn't resist inching closer. He wanted to see every detail, the intricate embroidery on their jackets, the stern expressions etched onto their faces, and most intriguingly, those legendary rifles. They weren't ordinary weapons. They were relics steeped in history, passed down through generations. Each rifle told a story, each scratch or dent marking battles fought, and victories won. To Greg, they seemed almost magical. As the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd began dispersing, but Greg lingered. Something about the rifles called to him, urging him to take one last look. He glanced around, noticing how distracted everyone else seemed. Parents wrangling children, couples posing for pictures, and tour guides ushering groups toward the exit. No one paid attention to him as he stepped closer to the barriers separating the spectators from the guardsmen. Just a little peek, he thought. What harm could it possibly do? Little did Greg know, his innocent curiosity was about to set off a chain reaction that would change the course of his trip and teach him a lesson he'd never forget. As Greg stood near the barriers, his eyes fixed on one of the guardsmen who had momentarily turned away to adjust something on his uniform. The rifle resting against the soldier's side caught Greg's attention once again. It shimmered under the sunlight, its polished surface reflecting tiny rainbows with every slight movement. For a moment, Greg forgot where he was. He wasn't just looking at a weapon. It was a piece of history, a masterpiece crafted with care and precision. His fingers twitched involuntarily, as if drawn by some invisible force. Without thinking twice, Greg leaned forward, stretching his arm over the barrier. His heart raced, partly from excitement, and partly from the thrill of doing something forbidden. Just one touch, he whispered to himself, trying to justify his actions. But fate has a way of turning small mistakes into big disasters. As his hand brushed against the rifle, it wobbled slightly. Before Greg could pull back, the weapon slipped completely out of place, teetering precariously before crashing to the ground with a deafening thud. Time seemed to freeze. The sound echoed through the courtyard like a thunderclap, silencing the murmurs of the crowd instantly. Everyone turned to look, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Tourists gasped, children stopped mid-laugh, and even the other guardsmen froze in their tracks. The once pristine rifle now lay broken in two on the cobblestones, its wooden stock splintered and its metal parts scattered around it. It was an unthinkable sight, a symbol of honor reduced to shards in mere seconds. Greg's stomach sank, His cheeks burned red as dozens of eyes locked onto him. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Instead, he stood there frozen, his hand still hovering awkwardly in the air, as if caught in the act of stealing candy from a jar. Panic bubbled inside him, but he couldn't move. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat and the faint whispers rippling through the crowd. "Did you see that?" someone muttered nearby. "He broke the rifle," another voice exclaimed, tinged with disbelief. "This is bad, really bad," a third person added, shaking their head. The guardsman whose rifle had fallen finally turned around, his expression unreadable at first. Then, slowly, realization dawned on his face. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed as they locked onto Greg. The transformation was subtle yet unmistakable. He went from being a stoic figure of discipline to someone visibly seething with anger. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, growing tense and heavy, like the calm before a storm. Greg tried to shrink back, hoping to disappear into the crowd, but it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no escaping the consequences. Around him, people began pulling out their phones, capturing the scene unfolding before them. Some recorded videos, while others snapped photos, eager to document the chaos caused by this clumsy tourist. Greg felt like a character in a movie, except this wasn't fiction. It was painfully real. For a brief moment, he considered apologizing right then and there, maybe even offering to pay for the repairs. But before he could muster the courage, the guardsman stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply against the stones. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one amplifying the tension in the air. Greg swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. Whatever happened next, he knew, would not be pleasant. The guardsman, Captain Elias, moved with a deliberate calm that was more intimidating than any shout or raised fist could have been. His polished boots clicked against the cobblestones as he approached Greg, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the now silent courtyard. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path between him and the trembling tourist. There was no mistaking the fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. It radiated from his piercing gaze and the rigid set of his jaw. Elias stopped just inches away from Greg, towering over him like a statue come to life. For a moment, he simply stared, letting the weight of what had happened sink in. Greg tried to meet his eyes, but quickly looked down, unable to bear the intensity of the soldier's glare. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional click of a camera as onlookers continued to capture the scene. Finally, Elias spoke, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded, his words sharp enough to make Greg flinch. When Greg didn't respond immediately, Elias leaned closer, his face inches from the tourists. "That rifle is not just a tool," he growled. "It is a symbol of honor, discipline, and centuries of tradition. And you broke it." Each word hit Greg like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to stammer an apology, but Elias wasn't finished. "You think this is some kind of museum exhibit, something for you to gawk at and touch without permission?" he asked, his tone rising slightly. "This isn't about you. This is about respect, for our culture, for our history, for everything we stand for." Greg felt smaller with every sentence, shrinking under the weight of Elias's words. He wanted to explain that it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to cause harm, but the shame bubbling inside him made it impossible to speak. Instead, he nodded weakly, his hands trembling at his sides. Around them, the crowd watched in stunned silence, some nodding in agreement with Elias, while others exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should intervene. Elias straightened up, his expression hardening further. "Accidents happen," he admitted, though his tone suggested he didn't fully believe Greg's actions were accidental. "But ignorance is no excuse. You cannot walk into another country, disregard its rules, and expect there to be no consequences." With that, he reached out suddenly, grabbing Greg firmly by the arm. The grip wasn't painful, but it was unyielding, a clear signal that resistance would be futile. Greg stumbled slightly as Elias began pulling him away from the crowd. People stepped back instinctively, forming a wide circle around them. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. Others simply watched, their faces a mix of fascination and unease. A few even cheered softly, clearly siding with the guardsman who seemed determined to teach this reckless tourist a lesson. As they moved toward a secluded courtyard adjacent to the palace, Greg glanced back at the crowd, hoping someone, anyone, would step forward to help. But no one did. The tourists who had been so eager to record the incident moments earlier now seemed content to let things play out, treating the whole situation like a live drama unfolding before their eyes. Even the local authorities present appeared hesitant to interfere, perhaps sensing that Elias's actions, though extreme, stemmed from a place of deep pride and frustration. By the time they reached the courtyard, Greg's mind was racing. What was going to happen to him? Would Elias call the police? Or worse, would he take matters into his own hands? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making his heart race even faster, as the heavy wooden door to the courtyard creaked shut behind them. Cutting off the noise of the crowd, Greg realized he was completely alone with the furious guardsman, and whatever punishment awaited him. The courtyard was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling square they had just left behind. The heavy wooden door creaked shut with a finality that sent a shiver down Greg's spine. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows high up on the stone walls, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The air felt cooler here, almost oppressive, as if the weight of centuries of tradition hung in the silence. For a moment, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the faint echo of their footsteps and the distant hum of the crowd outside. Elias released Greg's arm but didn't step back. Instead, he stood inches away, his towering frame blocking any chance of escape. His breathing was steady, controlled, but there was no mistaking the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. He studied Greg for a moment, as if sizing him up before finally speaking. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his voice low and measured, yet laced with barely contained anger. "You think breaking something sacred is a game?" Greg shook his head vigorously, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. No, I swear it was an accident," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking." "Exactly," Elias interrupted, his tone sharp. "You weren't thinking. That's the problem." He took a step closer, forcing Greg to take a step back. "Do you know how many hours we spend training? How much discipline it takes to carry ourselves with pride and respect? And then someone like you comes along and ruins it all because you couldn't follow simple rules." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? Every excuse felt hollow, every justification meaningless. He knew he was in the wrong, and Elias's piercing gaze only made the guilt feel heavier. The guardsman's presence was overwhelming, not just physically, but emotionally. It was as if Elias represented not just himself, but everything Greg had disrespected in that single careless moment. Without another word, Elias pointed to the center of the courtyard. "Stand there," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Greg hesitated for a split second before obeying, his legs moving almost involuntarily. Once Greg was in position, Elias began pacing around him, his boots clicking against the stones. "You want to understand what it means to break something so important?" he asked, his tone icy. "Then you're going to learn exactly what it takes to earn the right to even look at one of those rifles." Before Greg could process what that meant, Elias barked his first order. "Drop and give me 20 push-ups. Now." The command startled Greg, who blinked in confusion. Was this really happening? Was he about to be forced into doing exercises like some misbehaving schoolboy? But one look at Elias's stern expression told him there was no point in arguing. Reluctantly, Greg lowered himself to the ground, and began the push-ups, his arms shaking under the strain. Elias watched closely, ensuring each movement was done properly. Faster, he snapped when Greg slowed down. If you're going to disrespect us, you'll at least work hard enough to show some remorse. Sweat dripped from Greg's forehead as he struggled to keep up, his muscles burning with exertion. The courtyard seemed smaller now, the walls closing in as exhaustion set in. Yet Elias showed no mercy. After the push-ups came sprints across the length of the courtyard, followed by squats, lunges, and even simulated drills mimicking the precise movements of the palace guards during ceremonies. With each new exercise, Greg's body protested louder, but Elias's determination never wavered. "This is nothing compared to what we go through," he said at one point, his voice cutting through Greg's labored breathing. "Every day, we train harder than this. We push ourselves to the limit because our duty demands it. And you can't even stay behind a barrier." The physical toll was immense, but it was the emotional weight that truly broke Greg. As he panted and stumbled through the drills, he realized this wasn't just punishment. It was a lesson in discipline, respect, and accountability. By the time Elias finally called a halt, Greg was drenched in sweat, his clothes sticking to his skin, and his legs threatening to give way beneath him. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, too exhausted to even lift his head. But Elias wasn't done yet. He knelt beside Greg, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice quieter but still firm. "This isn't just about a broken rifle. It's about respecting boundaries, traditions, and the people who dedicate their lives to protecting them." Greg nodded weakly, tears welling up in his eyes. For the first time since the incident, he truly understood the gravity of his actions and the depth of Elias's frustration. Elias stood over Greg, his imposing figure casting a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly across the courtyard. The punishing drills had left Greg physically drained and emotionally raw, but Elias wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. He crouched down, his face now level with Greg's, and fixed him with a piercing stare. "You've done enough damage for one day," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But this isn't over. If you want to make things right, you'll do exactly as I say." Greg nodded weakly, still trying to catch his breath. His shirt clung to his sweat-soaked skin, and his hands trembled from exhaustion. Despite his fatigue, he knew better than to argue. Whatever Elias demanded next, he would comply, no matter how daunting it might be. The guardsman's words carried a weight that went beyond physical punishment. They struck at the core of Greg's sense of responsibility. "Tomorrow morning," Elias continued, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "you will return here. You will stand in front of the entire regiment during the changing of the guard ceremony. And you will apologize, not just to me, but to all of them." He paused, letting the gravity of his ultimatum sink in. "Your apology must be sincere. No excuses, no half-hearted attempts. If it isn't, there will be consequences far worse than what you've faced today." Greg's heart sank at the thought of standing before a crowd of stern-faced guardsmen, their polished rifles gleaming under the sun, while he confessed his mistake. It was humiliating, terrifying even. But deep down, he knew Elias was right. This wasn't just about repairing a broken rifle. It was about restoring respect for something greater than himself. Still, the idea of speaking publicly filled him with dread. I'll do it," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." Elias studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. When he found none, he nodded curtly. "Good, but that's not all." Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small slip of paper and handed it to Greg. On it was written an amount, enough to cover the cost of replacing the damaged rifle. "This is your second task," Elias explained. "By tomorrow evening, you will pay this amount in full. Consider it a reminder of the value of what you've destroyed." Greg took the paper with trembling hands, his mind racing. He hadn't planned on spending so much money during his trip, but he knew he had no choice. Paying for the rifle felt like the least he could do after everything that had happened. "I'll find a way," he muttered, clutching the slip tightly. "I'll make sure it's done." Satisfied, Elias rose to his feet and extended a hand to help Greg up. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Greg saw something unexpected in the guardsman's gaze, not just anger or authority, but a flicker of understanding. Perhaps Elias recognized Greg's genuine remorse, or maybe he simply believed in giving people a chance to redeem themselves. Whatever the reason, the tension between them eased slightly, though the underlying seriousness of the situation remained. As they walked back toward the main square, Elias reminded Greg of the importance of cultural sensitivity. "We welcome visitors because we want them to appreciate our traditions," he said, his voice softer now but still commanding attention. "But appreciation requires respect. Don't ever forget that." When they reached the edge of the courtyard, Elias stopped and turned to face Greg one last time. "Remember this day," he said firmly. "Let it shape how you interact with the world moving forward. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And earning it starts with acknowledging when you're wrong." With that, Elias turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Greg standing alone amidst the bustling tourists. Though physically exhausted and emotionally drained, Greg felt a strange sense of clarity washing over him. He realized that the grueling exercises and harsh words weren't meant to break him. They were meant to teach him. As he looked around at the vibrant city surrounding him, he vowed to approach the rest of his journey with humility and mindfulness. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Greg knew one thing for certain: he would never look at another culture's symbols or take another careless step without thinking twice. The next morning, Greg arrived at the palace square with a mix of dread and determination weighing heavily on his shoulders. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the cobblestones and bathing the towering palace in soft light. Tourists were already gathering, eager to witness the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. Greg stood apart from the crowd, fidgeting nervously as he adjusted the borrowed formal attire he had managed to acquire thanks to some sympathetic locals. It wasn't much, just a neatly pressed shirt and slacks, but it was enough to make him look presentable. As the clock struck 9, the rhythmic stomping of boots signaled the start of the ceremony. The guardsmen marched into the square with their usual precision, their uniforms immaculate and their expressions unreadable. Each step they took echoed through the air, a reminder of the discipline and tradition Greg had so carelessly disrespected. His stomach churned as he watched them take their positions, their rifles gleaming under the sunlight. He couldn't help but notice how every movement seemed deliberate, calculated, a stark contrast to his own clumsy actions the day before. Elias appeared shortly after, leading the procession with an air of authority that commanded respect. When his eyes met Greg's across the square, there was no warmth, only a steely resolve. Without a word, Elias gestured for Greg to join him on the platform where the guardsmen stood assembled. As Greg climbed the steps, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. People craned their necks to get a better look, whispering among themselves about who this nervous-looking man might be and why he was standing alongside the soldiers. Once Greg reached the platform, Elias turned to face the crowd, raising a hand to silence them. The chatter died down almost instantly, replaced by an expectant hush. All eyes were now on Greg, and he felt like a spotlight had been trained directly on him. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. For a moment, he considered bolting, running away, and pretending none of this had ever happened. But then he remembered Elias's words. Respect isn't given, it's earned. Taking a deep breath, Greg stepped forward, clutching the microphone Elias handed him. His voice trembled as he began to speak. "Good morning," he said, his words barely audible at first. Clearing his throat, he tried again, louder this time. "My name is Greg, and I'm here today because I made a terrible mistake." The crowd leaned in, captivated by his vulnerability. Greg went on to recount the events of the previous day, the curiosity that led him too close to the barriers, the accidental fall of the rifle, and the painful lessons he had learned since then. "What I did was thoughtless and disrespectful," he admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't understand the significance of what I was handling. And for that, I am truly sorry. These rifles aren't just objects. They're symbols of honor, history, and sacrifice. Breaking one was not only careless, but also an insult to everything these men represent." Greg paused, scanning the faces of the guardsmen standing before him. Some looked unmoved, their expressions stoic and unreadable. Others, however, nodded slightly, acknowledging his sincerity. Encouraged by this small sign of acceptance, Greg continued, "I want to apologize not just to Captain Elias, but to all of you for failing to show the respect you deserve. I hope my actions moving forward will prove that I've learned from this experience." When he finished speaking, the square remained silent for a few moments. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd. At first, it was hesitant, scattered even, but soon it grew into a steady wave of clapping and cheering. Even some of the guardsmen joined in, offering polite nods of approval. Greg exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was a start. Elias stepped forward once more, addressing the crowd. "Mistakes happen," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "What matters is how we choose to learn from them." Today, Greg has taken responsibility for his actions. Let us remember that respect goes both ways, both in giving it and earning it. As the ceremony resumed, Greg stepped off the platform, overwhelmed by a mix of relief and gratitude. Though the ordeal wasn't entirely behind him, he still needed to pay for the rifle repair. He knew he had taken the first step toward redemption, and as he walked away from the square, blending into the sea of tourists, he carried with him a newfound appreciation for the importance of cultural sensitivity and humility. In the days that followed Greg's public apology, the story of the clumsy tourist who broke a guardsman's rifle spread like wildfire. Videos of the incident and his heartfelt apology went viral online, sparking heated debates across social media platforms. Some viewers praised Greg for owning up to his mistake and facing the consequences with humility. "At least he apologized," one commenter wrote. Not everyone would have the guts to do that. Others, however, were less forgiving, criticizing him for being careless in the first place. "This is why people need to be more mindful when traveling." Another user chimed in, "You can't just touch everything you see." Tourist blogs and news outlets picked up the story, turning Greg into an unwitting celebrity of sorts. Photos of him standing on the platform during the ceremony circulated widely, accompanied by headlines like, "Tourist learns hard lesson after breaking guardsman's rifle," and "From blunder to redemption. A traveler's tale." For better or worse, Greg's face became synonymous with cultural mishaps, earning him both sympathy and ridicule. Despite the mixed reactions, Greg found himself reflecting deeply on the experience. Back in his hotel room, he spent hours scrolling through comments and articles about what had happened. At first, it stung to read some of the harsher criticisms, but as time passed, he began to see them differently. They weren't just attacks. They were reminders of how important it was to approach new cultures with care and respect. He realized that while he couldn't change the past, he could use this moment as a turning point, a chance to grow and become a better traveler. To fulfill his promise to Captain Elias, Greg worked tirelessly to gather the money needed to repair the rifle. He reached out to friends and family, explaining the situation and asking for help. To his relief, they responded with understanding and support. "Everyone makes mistakes," his sister told him over the phone. "What matters is that you're making things right." With their assistance, Greg managed to collect the required amount within a few days. When he returned to the palace to hand over the payment, Elias greeted him with a nod of approval. "You kept your word," the guardsman said simply, though there was a hint of respect in his tone. For the first time since their encounter, Greg felt a genuine connection with Elias, not as adversaries, but as two individuals bound by a shared understanding of accountability. Before leaving, Elias handed Greg a small token, a pin bearing the insignia of the palace guards. "A reminder," he explained, "so you don't forget what you've learned here." As Greg continued his travels, he noticed a shift in his mindset. Gone was the reckless enthusiasm that had driven him to cross barriers and ignore warning signs. In its place was a newfound sense of mindfulness and appreciation for the places he visited. Whether exploring ancient ruins, attending local festivals, or interacting with residents, he made a conscious effort to observe quietly, listen intently, and tread lightly. Small gestures, a polite bow, a respectful question, a moment of gratitude, became second nature to him. Word of Greg's transformation even reached some of the locals he encountered along the way. One shopkeeper, recognizing him from the viral videos, smiled warmly and said, "I heard about what happened. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. You've done well." Such moments filled Greg with pride, not because he sought validation, but because they proved he was changing, for the better. By the time Greg boarded his flight home, he felt like a different person. The trip had been far from perfect, but it had taught him invaluable lessons about responsibility, humility, and the importance of respecting traditions that weren't his own. As the plane soared above the clouds, Greg pulled out the pin Elias had given him and held it tightly in his palm. It wasn't just a souvenir. It was a symbol of growth, a reminder of the day he stumbled but ultimately stood back up stronger than before. And so what began as a disastrous misstep ended as a journey of self-discovery, one that Greg knew would stay with him long after the memories of landmarks and landscapes faded away. Months after Greg returned home, the memory of his ill-fated trip lingered, not as a source of shame, but as a powerful lesson that continued to shape his life. The broken rifle incident had become more than just a story. It was a turning point, a moment that forced him to reevaluate how he interacted with the world around him. Friends and family noticed the change in him almost immediately. Gone was the impulsive adventurer who charged headfirst into every situation without thinking. In his place stood someone calmer, more thoughtful, someone who approached new experiences with humility and care. Greg often found himself sharing the story with others, not out of pride, but because he believed it carried an important message. At dinner parties, during work breaks, or while chatting with fellow travelers at local meetups, he recounted the events leading up to the fateful day. The curiosity that overtook him, the weight of Elias's anger, and the grueling punishment that followed. But most importantly, he talked about what came after. The apology, the lessons learned, and the small yet meaningful steps he took to make amends. His audience would listen intently, their expressions shifting between amusement, disbelief, and admiration. Some even thanked him for reminding them of the importance of cultural sensitivity when exploring unfamiliar places. The internet hadn't forgotten either. Every now and then, Greg would stumble upon memes or TikTok videos referencing the tourist who broke the rifle. While some posts mocked him, many praised his willingness to own up to his mistake and face the consequences. A particularly popular thread on Reddit titled, "Lessons Learned from Travel Fails," featured Greg's story prominently, with users leaving hundreds of comments debating everything from personal responsibility to the value of respecting traditions. Reading these discussions made Greg realize that his experience resonated with people far beyond his own circle. It sparked conversations about accountability and mutual respect in ways he never anticipated. Back in the city where it all happened, Captain Elias also reflected on the incident in his own quiet way. Though he never sought recognition for his actions, the story of how he handled the situation earned him praise among his peers and superiors. Some called it a masterclass in discipline and leadership, while others admired the way he balanced firmness with fairness. For Elias, however, the real reward lay in seeing Greg's transformation. He knew not everyone would react so positively to being held accountable, But Greg's sincerity and determination proved that sometimes tough love could inspire real change. Years later, Greg decided to revisit the city that had once taught him such a profound lesson. This time, he came prepared, with deeper knowledge of its history, customs, and etiquette. As he walked through the familiar streets, memories flooded back, but instead of cringing at the thought of his past blunder, he smiled. He felt proud of how far he'd come since then. When he arrived at the palace square, he spotted Elias standing nearby, overseeing another changing of the guard ceremony. Their eyes met briefly, and though neither man said a word, a silent understanding passed between them. It was a look of acknowledgement, a nod to the journey they had both traveled, albeit in very different ways. Before leaving the city, Greg visited a local artisan shop and purchased a small replica of the ceremonial rifle. He didn't buy it as a trophy or a keepsake, but as a reminder of the day he learned one of life's toughest lessons. Back home, he placed it on a shelf in his study, alongside other mementos from his travels. Whenever he glanced at it, he was reminded of the importance of respecting boundaries, traditions, and the people who dedicate their lives to preserving them. In the end, Greg's story became more than just a cautionary tale. It was a testament to growth, redemption, and the power of second chances. Both he and Elias emerged from the ordeal wiser and stronger, carrying with them lessons they would cherish forever. And though their paths might never cross again, the bond they formed through conflict and resolution remained, a quiet reminder that even the most unlikely encounters can leave lasting impressions.